Okay, guys, we're still in chapter 2. The previous recording, whatever lecture, was on Jamestown. Now let's take a look at the most important Puritan colony, the Puritan colony of Massachusetts Bay. So I'm going to be specifically talking about those colonies that were heavily, if not totally, influenced by their religious affiliations, right? Jamestown, nothing to do with religion. It was purely a private business enterprise, right? They're going over there to make money. Puritans, a bit different, right? Now, before we can enter into that discussion, I need to briefly lay some groundwork as to what's going on in Europe at this same time period in order for you to truly understand what this is all about. Now, I'm not going to test you on anything I'm about to say here for the next few seconds, but I do want you to listen so you'll get a good, firm foundation of what's motivating and driving these Puritans to come to the New World, okay? So there were religious motivations for colonization, and they were a result of the Protestant Reformation, which challenged some of the basic practices and beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. Tensions over issues of theological doctrine within the Roman Catholic Church built until finally reaching a boiling point in the 16th century. Martin Luther's doctrine of justification by faith convinced many that one's salvation was not determined by the amount of works accomplished while alive, nor was it determined by potential purgatorial suffering after death. Salvation for Luther was a divine gift rendered to all who profess faith. And Luther quickly won a wide following among ordinary men and women in Northern Europe. And when the Pope excommunicated Luther in about 1520, he began leading his followers out of the Catholic Church entirely. Now, that's on the continent of Europe. It was a purely religious Reformation. Our focus needs to be on England, where these Puritans originate from. And in England, within this atmosphere of theological disputation going on in this Protestant Reformation, the king, Henry VIII, found that he could position himself against the church, the Catholic Church that was in England, with assistance of anti-clerical sympathizers in a move to gain control of the money the church controlled in England and the land they controlled. And after 1534, Henry's administration no longer allowed the further establishing of intercessory institution by the Catholic Church. And he officially broke with the Catholic Church in 1534 with something known as the Act of Royal Supremacy, which brought all the institution of intercessory prayer under renewed attack. Okay? Now, the English Reformation was at first more a result of a political dispute between the king and the pope than of any doctrinal revolt, right? I mean, I'm sure you've heard in your literature classes or maybe even in a world history course that in 1529, Henry was very angry at the refusal of the Pope to grant him a divorce, right? And he began to break ties with the Catholic Church. Of course, it doesn't become official to 1534. And he established himself as the head of the Christian faith in his country. Called it the Church of England, right? But there was no difference. No difference in that church or the Catholic Church other than he was the head, not the Pope. And after his death, subsequent kings and queens would follow the same tradition, ending, of course, with Elizabeth, who would distance her nation tremendously so from any connection with the Catholic Church. Now look, we basically just did the Protestant Reformation in less than 5 minutes. And that's got to be a record somewhere. And of course, my old Reformation professor would blow a gasket if she knew I'd done that. But you need to have some of this background to truly appreciate what's about to happen. Now, this is all world history stuff. So again, I'm not going to test you on it, but you needed it. So back to the actual elements of Chapter 2, surrounding the creation of Massachusetts Bay and these Puritans. So what are we talking about here? Well, these Puritan colonies we'll eventually get to were the first of any deeply religiously inspired settlements. I mean, today, some say that the Puritans were the source of all good and nobility of our society, the source of our morality and democracy, yet some say they're also the source of all that's intolerant in today's society. Therefore, we should probably really examine the motives of these early settlers. Now, the Puritans reportedly left England due to a desire for religious freedom. Yet isn't it ironic that once in the New World they allowed for no toleration for other religions? This points to a need to understand the Puritans on their own grounds. Now, the Puritan colony in Massachusetts Bay was what I call an experiment in applied theology. It was the largest of any Puritan colony in New England. John Winthrop, who would eventually be the first governor of Massachusetts Bay, gave a very famous speech when they were crossing the Atlantic. It's known as the City on a Hill speech. And what is he saying in this speech? Well, he's saying that this city they're about to create was going to be a city built on purely religious beliefs. Here in the New World, Massachusetts Bay, the Puritans were going to attempt to reveal the true, quote-unquote, way to God for all to see. An example to the entire world they were going to be. You see, they had a mission to show the whole world how to get to heaven. Now, the Puritans of New England were to be themselves, according to Winthrop, visible saints and their city upon a hill. Now, Puritans took their theology, in other words, their interpretation of theology, from John Calvin. And Calvin held that there was an all-powerful God and a mankind that was essentially depraved, sinful since the fall of man. Now, most Christians, with the exception of Quakers, believed in this doctrine of original sin. But Calvinists, which are Puritans, and when you say Calvinist, that means anybody that follows the teachings of John Calvin. And that's what a Puritan is. But where Calvinists parted company with the majority of Christians on this issue of the fall and essential depravity was their extreme emphasis on the depravity of man. Calvinists also did not believe in democracy or rule by the majority. That was because for the majority, for Calvin, was made up of the damned. Had you be breaking covenants with God and maintaining a godly society if you let democracy rule. Calvin also denied the concept of free will. Instead, he held that certain individuals were predestined for salvation or damnation. Nothing could alter this state, which was appointed by God. Free will was not accepted by Puritans. Salvation was received was received by grace of God alone. See, works for them were not influential. It was a non-issue. So God's electing some people to be saved and condemning others to damnation. Each person's destiny was determined before birth, according to Calvin, and no one could change that during their life. Calvinist Puritans also believed in something called the covenant of grace. And this was a covenant by which God entered into an agreement. I liken it to basically a handshake deal between God and humanity, through which humanity had a chance for some to attain salvation. Those that entered that covenant were called the elect. Okay? The elect. And the idea was that the elect, even them, deserved damnation, but since God was merciful, some would receive his grace. Therefore, everyone wants to keep God's law. And one of the things that Puritans are going to try to do here in Massachusetts Bay is create a very, very strict society to make sure everyone was keeping God's laws and commandments, the covenant of grace. Okay? They're going to enforce this on their entire society. But you'll see it's going to gradually break down because according to Calvinists and these Puritans, if so much as one person slips up, it could risk everyone's eternal salvation. Now, those who accepted Calvin's teachings came to believe that the way they led their lives might reveal to them their chances of salvation. A wicked or useless existence would be a sign of damnation. Saintliness, diligence, and success were signs of grace. So what happens here is Calvinism creates a lot of anxieties amongst its followers. But it also produced a very strong incentive to lead virtuous, productive lives. Now, the last thing on this covenant of grace. The covenant of grace is important simply because, if for no other reason, it was a personal relationship between one individual and their God. There was no need for a hierarchy, in other words, for someone to step in between a person and their God. This is a totally individualistic concept. And that spirit of individualism will come with these Puritans to the New World and play havoc with thoughts of who ought to rule and who shouldn't rule. Now, remembering what we discussed about the Reformation in England provides a little light into what is happening here in these colonies. Puritans were Protestants, non-Catholics, in England who did not feel that the Church of England had reformed itself enough away from the Catholic Church. And so some who were being affected by teachings over in Europe, like Calvin, were clamoring for more and more reforms that would, quote unquote, purify the Church of England. And as a result, they became known as Puritans. Okay? Now, these Puritans, their discontent, grew increasingly over what they saw as the failure of political and ecclesiastical authorities to respond to their demands in England. And that only increased with the death of Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, and the ascension of James I. James was convinced that kings rule by divine right, and he quickly antagonized Puritans by resorting to illegal and arbitrary taxation measures, favoring English Catholics in the granting of charters and other favors, and by supporting these high church forms of ceremony these Puritans disliked. So by the early 17th century, there were a lot of religious nonconformists like the Puritans that were beginning to look for places of refuge outside of England. And although they didn't want to separate from England, separate from the Church of England, they were having no luck in reforming the Church of England like they wanted to. Okay? In fact, the Church of England was distancing itself from Puritan belief. Therefore, an alternative method presented itself. Hey, why don't we travel to the New World, where we could feel free to institute our own version of the quote-unquote true church. And in this way, the Church of England would see our truth and be moved to convert and reform. So by taking this approach, they could be seen as not running away, nor rebelling against the king, which might get you killed. Okay? Remember that although at the beginning of the lecture, students might think that Puritans are hypocrites, they never were hypocrites. They never wanted toleration of religion. They said they knew the one and only way. So in the 1620s, there were a series of joint stock companies, here we go again, involved in fishing and various trade endeavors off the coast of New England. And the Puritans heard of these and they saw their potential. So in 1629, the King of England chartered the Massachusetts Bay Company, of which Puritans were the majority owners. And the charter stated that the members would meet 4 times a year by which to make laws and regulations for their company. And it also stated that these meetings would take place wherever physically the charter was housed. Now, the Crown, never imagining the actual charter would be housed anywhere other than England, were shocked when the Puritans took their charter with them to New England. And they got off their boats in Massachusetts Bay and claimed they could govern themselves based on their charter. Pretty sneaky, pretty smart. So they arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1630, led by John Winthrop, and having observed what had transpired in Virginia, the Puritans brought skilled craftsmen, skilled labor, and they did quite well that first year. Now the government of Massachusetts Bay was based on the Massachusetts Bay Charter, right? And they created something called the General Court. That was their governing body, okay? And what has eventually transpired there in Massachusetts Bay because of the religious overtones is you ended up with, males of the elect, right? Church members, males of the elect. They ran the church and they ran the government of Massachusetts Bay, okay? With me on this? Now, there's another key to the Massachusetts Bay Company and the Puritan society there. If this society was going to work, they needed church religious uniformity. In other words, the church and the state were going to have to work hand in hand together to maintain uniformity of thought. In other words, you can't have differences of opinion, right? Because when you're trying to create a city on a hill, you cannot afford to have anybody with any wrong ideas, especially if you believe in this covenant of grace, because if so much as one person messes it up, we all could be in trouble. And of course, they're going to be individuals with different ideas. Now, you're going to read about a few in your textbook. Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. I want to talk about Roger here because some very important things flow out of the impact of Roger Williams, this Puritan in Massachusetts Bay. Now, Roger Williams was a Puritan minister living in Salem, Massachusetts, and he urged his congregation that if his colony would not separate away from the Church of England, that they should separate away from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, there goes the city on the hill concept, right? Again, for this community to succeed according to their own concepts, all had to be on the same page and toe the line. And here's somebody challenging that precept and in the process threatening the all-important covenant of grace. Now, Roger Williams, according to these Puritans, had all kinds of troublesome ideas. I mean, he's walking around saying that, non-elects shouldn't be allowed in the church and saying that the settlers shouldn't be taking land away from Indians. So to the Puritans out there, Roger Williams talking crazy talk. And this can't be allowed to occur. So by 1635-ish, Williams had become so difficult, Puritan ministers were forced to condemn him for his positions, and the general court followed suit and banished him from the colony. Okay? Now, he's going to leave in about 1636. And he goes and founds a new community. He called it Providence, which eventually evolves into the colony of Rhode Island. Here in what will become Rhode Island, Williams continued his search for a pure church. And he finally came to the conclusion, that he was only sure of two things. That he and his wife were the only two people he knew for sure were of the elect. And he's going to finally give up on the pure church concept and become what is known as a seeker, seeking God in his own personal manner, not being part of any organized religion, and that's what he preaches in Rhode Island. So he decides that there's no way that there's ever going to be an absolutely pure church. And he came to believe that the best way in which each and every individual should approach God was to be a seeker like him. Everyone should be free to seek God in his own personal way. So here's why this is important. So we can say, as historians, that in 1636, for the first time in Rhode Island, there developed the concept of religious freedom. Religious freedom. There was no established church in this community. This is the first place of freedom of religion. Quakers were tolerated. They even tolerated non-Christian faiths. Now, one more thing I think most think is pretty important in this country. Since they had religious freedom, they had no need for a government to enforce any particular religion. So the result in Rhode Island in 1636 as well, the concept of separation of church and state. So very important things flow out of the Puritan experiment in Massachusetts Bay. Now look, is that why they came to the New World, to create religious freedom and separation of church and state? Absolutely not. They do not believe in either of those things. They believe in no toleration of no other religions. They believe in church and state working hand in hand together. But a byproduct of them coming over here is Roger Williams. And the byproduct of Roger Williams being here is going off and creating a whole new community and two concepts that become very important to the future of your country today. Now to wrap this thing up, by about 1660, the Puritan experiment of Massachusetts Bay was weakening. It's failing. And there were some reasons for this, I think. These are just my reasons. They're not in your textbook. I think for number one, that for a high level of religious intensity like they had, it had to be maintained for a very long time to succeed. And I think that's hard for anybody. Think about it. You can't just, halfway do this thing. You've got to be a true believer, every day of the week, every year. And by 1660, it was an entirely new and younger generation who were finding themselves drawn to other interests that might not be spiritual. That's just human nature, I think. Secondly, I think Massachusetts Bay had become a very successful colony economically. They're making a lot of money. Manufacture of rum was an example of one of their biggest exports. So this was drawing much of the attention away from the spiritual towards that of the physical. Puritans were becoming concerned with their present life over concern for their spiritual life. Again, I think it's just human nature. And lastly, there'd been a perfect chance in the 1640s and 50s in England for the city on a hill concept to be copied, but it wasn't taken advantage of. And I'm talking about the Puritan Revolution back in England that you're not going to be tested on. The point being that back in England, there was a Puritan Revolution where the Puritans took over and they ran England. So the Puritans had an opportunity to say, hey, let's create a perfect church. But there were so many different opinions as to what the perfect church could be, they never could decide on what it was. And so by 1660, they gave up. They completely gave up. They had killed the King of England. Well, they invited his son to come back and run the country, Charles II. It's called the Restoration. It's mentioned in your textbook. So that's what's going on. Basically, they're inviting the monarchy to say, hey, yes, we killed your dad, but why don't you come back? You be king. Let's go back to what it was like before. No more Puritan church. We institute the Church of England. And everything went back to being the way it had before. Okay? And what happens, again, very short here, the new king, who obviously doesn't like Puritans, come on, they killed his dad. He'll get into some legal arguments with the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, strip them of their charter, and make Massachusetts Bay a royal colony in 1691. Okay? And he left pretty much everything the same in Massachusetts Bay. He let the same people run it. He left that general court, the governing body, left it alone. The only change he made was that instead of the elect, right, the elect being the only people in charge, he instituted the standard voting practice of England. Any white male that owned property and paid taxes could be elected. So we can say by 1691 that rule by the elect was over, the city on the hill experiment is over, and this experiment had failed completely. Clear cut. Okay? Usually in my face-to-face courses we talk about the impact of the failure of this colony in 1691 because I draw a direct correlation to the failure of this colony and the emergence of these witchcraft trials, the Salem witchcraft trials in 1691. So I'm done with the Puritan colony in Massachusetts Bay. I hope that it's given you some insight on what was going on beyond what your textbook says. But similar things were happening in all of those colonies your textbook mentions in the way that these two colonies were created. And I chose Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay simply because they both originate in similar manners in the sense of people coming over through joint stock companies, right? One based on purely economic motivations and the other purely religious motivations. One is very successful in the sense that it creates a colony, doesn't make any money. The other is successful in that it creates a colony, but it's not a proven religious success. So they're similar in that fashion. And some very important things come out of both those colonies, obviously. Okay, then. So I'll talk to you guys later when we talk about something I call the old colonial system, summarizing several of your next few chapters.